Because you know there's a handful of people actually run everything. That's true. It's provable. Not
It's all
conspiracy.
about control. To them we just cattle, numbers, battling each other while they creeping in the shadows, scheming, plotting, clocking your every move, locked in your mind, brainwashed until it's rocking. Got the population operating as they want them, symbolically mocking them, thinking nothing can stop them. So open your eyes to the lies of the evil, the poison in the minds and the lives of your people. And every time they lead you down a line to deceive you, and by then it's always too late to see through the veil that they hide behind, cause your third eye is blind. Better take a stand, we running out of time. Ain't nobody coming to save us, fuck what you had in mind. Arm yourself with the truth and jump behind the battle line. Can we turn it around? Yeah, it's possible. Divided we'll all fall, but united we're unstoppable. This is for the world, this is for the masses, attached to the strings being pulled by puppet masters. This is for the youth, searching for the proof, keep on looking for the clues. I'll provide you with some truth. This is for the ones waking up from the spell, beginning to discover themselves. Yeah, this is for the youth, searching for the truth, keep on looking for the clues. I'll provide you with some proof. This is for the world. Yeah.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of A Hitchhiker's Guide to Truth. I'm your host, James Cordiner. My website is freeyourmindne.com. This evening, we have a terrific guest, a returning champion of the show, Brandon Martin. I'll bring him in just a moment. First, I just want to, real quick, just go over the housekeeping, and then we'll bring him in. So, 1 second here. And here we go. Make sure that we have it shared this time. Okay, so I'm going to be giving a presentation at S.E.E.D 5 Metamorphosis. It's a free online conference about the occult, esotericism, freedom, history, philosophy, symbolism, and natural law. It's going to be September 23rd and the 24th this year, 2023. And all-star lineup: myself, James Gordiner, Douglas Martin, Nate Cap, Mark Passio, Chris Jansen, Will Keller, Brandon Martin, Leslie Powers, Brandon Spencer, Patty Lager, Dorian Greens, Colin Smith, Dylan McCormick, Mark Devlin, Corey Andrulot, Logan Hart, and Seth Esposa. So go over to seedtruth.com to learn more about that. And then after that, let me see here. We got hold on 1 second. Sorry, I'm a little. Here we go. All right. So Black Pill Digest. Oh, that's not right. Anyways, Black Pill Digest. We are going live once a month with that show. Sean McCann and I team up, and we, really go hard on some real black pill topics in hopes to empower people and wake people up to what they can do to fight back against the bastards. So check us out. This month, we're going to be going live on the 29th, and we're going to be talking about technocracy. So there's that. Then I want to also promote the How to Become the True Media online technology skill sharing seminar this year, 2023. It's an intensive 23-week technology skill sharing seminar hosted on Telegram by Mark Passio of whatonearthishappening.com. This year, he's going to be sticking again with a Monday evening schedule. So it's going to start every Monday evening at 8 p.m., going to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And enrollment is now officially open. So get over to howtobecomthetruemedia.com to figure out how you can enroll. And we're going to be promoting that. We're going to continue to promote that until enrollment is closed. Enrollment closes on July 4th because class starts on July 10th and class ends on December 11th. So that's a total of 23 weeks, 23 classes. There's limited space available. So get over there and enroll. We're streaming on One Great Work Network. That's onegreatworknetwork.com. There's over 70 content creators on onegreatworknetwork.com. I suggest you get your butts over there and check them out. So much great talent over there trying to make the voice of truth even louder, because in times like these, well, we need to be as loud as it possibly can be. And I already talked about seed metamorphosis. So again, seedtruth.com. And so we have Brandon Martin, and he is actually the progenitor of seedtruth.com, joining us this evening. Hey, Brandon, what's going on, dude?
Howdy, James. It's great to be back, man.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thanks for being here. It's going to be a great show. I'm wicked excited about this topic because there's not there's not a lot of talking about what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're here to talk about the history of anarchism and where it, like, I guess where it really started, how it, and try to bridge the gap between then and how it's going today. So it's always been a scene that drags revolutionaries into it, and you have a wide range of knowledge of this topic, and I'm going to be learning some stuff tonight too. So I'm really happy that you're here to teach me and the audience about anarchism and the history of it. So
Yeah, I think that this will be very crucial and hopefully very motivating to the community that we're in, or anybody who is new to any of our work, right? Like you said, a lot of people don't really talk about this topic too much, even though we do see a lot of discussion about history and stuff like this. And I felt like this is something that should be put on the table. And, I studied the history of anarchism back in my 20s very deeply. And it kind of, and I wrote a bunch of essays on it and all this stuff. And, this idea just kind of spawned in my head like, hey, because I asked people, the reason why it spawned in my head is because I ask people all the time, like, hey, what do you know about the history of anarchism? And usually they come back with like, I don't really know anything about it. And the other answer that I get back, like from anarchists themselves, if they've actually looked into it at all, is usually just from the Industrial Revolution, which hopefully we will be able to get to that if time allows for all that. So yeah, I really felt like this is a crucial topic for people, considering that we do promote the anarchistic philosophy and the ideology, and we are seeking to, abolish the state and the government or slavery. And I think that another point and a caveat to what I'll be talking about here is that I'm not a historian, first of all, so I'm not an expert in this field. So if I happen to leave out things or like overlook things or just kind of jump around with some stuff, that's just the nature of the game. We have a limited amount of time, and I have certain bullet points that I've made note of that I feel that are very crucial for this. But there's a lot of stuff as you get into the past century that you can really overlook, especially when you come into 1900s and forward, obviously the past century. So if I happen to overlook something or miss that, hey, that's great that you got it. I'm really glad that you're looking into that because it's very important. But don't crucify us if we happen to overlook something that you feel is crucial to this whole, layout, this chronological order of anarchism and the ideology.
yeah, I mean, we're just two guys doing a podcast together, and I'm sure it won't be. It might not even be the last time we do a podcast on this topic. So tonight is just tonight. Today, this round is just this round. So maybe we do it again, and we kind of go through with another fine tooth comb, if you will, and we get to some other important bullet points. So
Absolutely.
where do we begin with this? Because I mean, we always talk about etymology of words, and it seems that we're always talking about Latin etymology, Greek etymology of words and terms, and anarchy has a Greek etymology. So are we right to assume that anarchy itself as a movement or as an ideology goes all the way back to ancient Greece?
Yeah, and actually, okay, so the term, the ideology, definitely goes directly to Hellenistic Greece, right? But if we want to talk about the philosophy that goes beyond that, before the term was ever created, we actually see this going back to what I've traced back to totemic societies. So we find this idea of statelessness and kind of mutual aid, cooperation, or cooperative hierarchy, or volunteerism within all indigenous cultures all over the world. And if you really want to look at it, you can take it all the way back to ancient Egypt and, pre-dynastic Egypt, and you can go really, really deep into that. And that's a really ambiguous topic to get into, because as you go further back in history, there's less documentation, right? So you have to study the culture, and you kind of have to be able to put the pieces together, because there's less references to go off of as you go further and further back, besides like the forms. And as you come into, dynastic Egypt and stuff like that, you get hieroglyphs. And, we're talking about something that, predates written language, really. And that's kind of the thing. Like it's beyond it. It takes off after we come out of the age of like just survival of the fittest, pretty much, of like primitivism, right? Where we actually start to structure our communities and our tribes and how we're structuring those things. And then we have this idea of the state emerging out of these ideas, specifically the failure to understand the dangers of like socialism, capitalism, and things like this, communism, and the belief in authority comes about because of the religious kind of incentives that we have going on. So there's a lot to this, right? It's very sophisticated when you get into the past. But as we come out, let's just say, like, I can give a couple examples here, So like in dynastic Egypt, you had a lot of dissonant voices against the authorities at hand when we had a state emerge in Egypt. So we had people like, his name was Ptahhotep or Pahotep, something like that. I'll probably butcher a bunch of people's names, but Pahotep, I think, is his name. And he was an individual who espoused an idea of self-autonomy, stateless society, and he spoke out against the pharaohs of his time. So that's kind of an anarchistic idea, right? It's an idea of, I get to rule myself, I'm a sovereign being, and I don't need to obey this idea of a state or any individual that claims to be the lawmaker, really, right? Because that's what this all comes down to, is that individuals are claiming to be the lawmaker rather than living in harmony with natural law. And the anarchistic thought, which you could call it whatever, libertarian thought, anarchistic thought, free thinking, voluntarism, it doesn't really matter. This has always been an expression because our natural state is to live in freedom. So we always have this expression of rebellion. So anarchistic thought is just rebellion against any forms of oppression against the individual's liberties. So we always see that, we see this in many examples throughout history. But as it moves forward, we actually see it come into Asia very prevalently in 600 BCE with the Tao Te Ching, with Lao Tzu. And he actually put forward this idea of self-autonomy, and he spoke about decentralization of authority, and he spoke about things within his form of Wu Wei. A lot of people know about Wu Wei, which is about non-aggression. So this is the non-aggression principle, and kind of a pacifistic ideology without the self-defense ideology, though there is self-defense within that. It's just, that's how a lot of people look at Wu Wei. And so his philosophy was like speaking out against the centralization of governments and the state in Asia. So that's in 600 BCE, right? So from there, like, we can definitely look into the Grecian period when we actually do, like, first thing I'd like to point out, these terms, and the term anarchy was not used, obviously, right? So we're just talking about the ideology, the philosophy of rebelling against the state authority or things like this, right? And so when we get to the Grecian period, Hellenistic Greece, we definitely have a boom, right? A reemergence of like enlightened thought, if you want to look at it, depending on how you look at origins. So that's why I don't really want to get into the origins of the species too much here, because that's a very complicated subject. We're just trying to pinpoint some of the remnants of the philosophy that we have, right? So I'm not going to talk about the origins, where this stuff could have came from, whether it's extraterrestrial or human. We're not going to get into any of that stuff, because I know a lot of people are probably going to be like, oh, the state came from the extraterrestrials, or oh, it came from, all this stuff, right? So that's not important here. What's important and what we're talking about here is just like tracing back the remnants and the pieces that we have about anarchism, obviously. And I trace it back to totemic and indigenous cultures. So like you said, we have the Greek word anarchy, which means no masters, no rulers. It also can be translated to no chief, because in Greece, in Hellenistic Greece, there was what was called the nine magistrates, and those were the archons, and they also were called the what's the word, eponymous archons is what they're called, eponymous archons, and you can look that up. And it's like the way the state was structured. That word's it was a little, fluttering in my head. I haven't used it very much, but yeah, the eponymous archons. And at the time, we had different philosophers that rose up, such as Diogenes, Zeno, Epicurus, who were espousing a rebellious lifestyle and rebellious philosophy against the eponymous archons at this time. And this is why, this word kind of arose. Now, they weren't self-proclaimed to be anarchists, right? They didn't say we are anarchists in any of their philosophies, but the term was used generally to represent a state or a condition of freedom or disorder from the state, right? So they would look at it as going back to primitivism, They would say, oh, without the state, without, the kind of systems that we have set up from the state, whether it's, some form of democracy or republic, we have a disorder, a chaos, right? So we look at this as chaos because everybody wants to control everything, and this is where that authoritarian mindset has bound people, right? So we do have this arising in their philosophies, is my point. So if you look into Diogenes, he was one who was kind of a cynic, and cynics were like the hippies who smell bad, who kind of criticize everything, right? Who are cynical. This is where we get the idea of cynicalism, but he was kind of like a vagabond in a way, right? In a way, or a nomad, because he would like live in a barrel. He didn't care. He's like, I'm going to live in the way that I choose to live against your form of order, and you're not going to tell me otherwise. So like Plato and Socrates would actually like make fun of him and joke, and they would play pranks on each other through this time period, which was really, really interesting. And it was crazy, but he was like the laughing stock of the town, but he still espoused a philosophy of independent thought, and of like self-autonomy. And that was so rare to them. And then you have people who were more sophisticated, who were like more in the schools at that point, in the scholarship, you could say at that point, which were like Zeno and Epicurus. And a lot of people know who Epicurus is because he's a revolutionary, writer. And I think if you don't know about him, you should look into him a little bit more than Plato, honestly. But they espoused the same concept. They spoke out against the authorities of the state. And I mean, you could even take it back to Socrates in some way, even though he wasn't necessarily anti-state. He definitely espoused like anti-authoritarian ideologies, even though he was pretty much executed by the state. He willfully took the hemlock because there was a bunch of events that happened, but one of the reasons why was because he was educating the children, and the state thought that was a threat to their control. So they convicted him, and then they, had him take hemlock, which is a poison. And, he died, and he willfully accepted that as a judgment, even though he spoke out against that. So, it's very complex, like when you get so far back into this stuff. So anarchism is definitely rooted in stateless societies, like I was saying, in totemic cultures. And then you can follow those ideas as these tribes start to form more organized structures of like systems of agriculture and what we're doing with our resources, the production and distribution of labor and all that stuff, right? That's a big thing, obviously. And this is why like a lot of people only look at anarchism as a political thing rather than like a philosophical lifestyle, because they look at it as only to deal with the material realm of like, hey, what are we doing with the resources? And resources also include the product of labor of the resources of man. And they're looked at as resources, right? So I know that was a mouthful, and sorry to take the floor, but there's a little bit for you.
Oh no, please take the floor. That's fine. It's it's amazing that has been consistently throughout time. I mean, of course, it's always been about questioning authority, and like that is from my understanding of what the Athenians had such a problem with Socrates. It was because like we understand the Socratic method is to just basically start asking questions, and Socrates would be the guy to stand up and go, "Hey, why? Why
Right, right.
this? Why that? Why? Why?" And this like keep going down that path, and they didn't like that. And then you have Aristotle
Hmm.
was Socrates's understudy there. He like took the mantle up, and then you have the development of Aristotelian logic and the trivium really being put into education and everything like that. So I really appreciate how far back the questioning of authority has existed, but you're right, it wasn't necessarily a philosophical thing or a lifestyle. It doesn't seem like that. It just seems more like a uh, through history. It seems almost like anarchism was a temporary condition, and when people thought that maybe the ruling class was doing them wrong, so they would start questioning it, they would start rebelling against it, only for long enough until they felt comfortable with a reformation of said ruling class, and then they would back down and proceed with letting a ruling class exist. Where in modern times, the revolution, even within the anarchist community itself, so it's all about revolutionaries throughout history. And it seems that nowadays we're really honing in on sticking to the principles, learning teaching, learning, then teaching, and sticking to set the principles, and under which there would be no ruling class at all, and that we're finally at a point now where we would be like we would be able to say, no, 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 we have learned from our past mistakes over the course of the last however many thousands of years, and we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to do this. We're getting off the wheel. So um I'm really excited to see how we bridge that gap, where um because and what I mean by even a revolution, even within the anarchist community, is because we've seen in modern times, ever since, what would it be? I guess it would be the late '90s, when they had that Black Bloc movement out in the on the West Coast, because of, geez, some government summit or whatever. I'm unfamiliar with the exact terms, but it was in like the late '90s when they had like the trade organization came over to the West Coast of the United States, and the people out there, they really started, really doing some damage to that to the trade organization that was having the meeting out there. And ever since then, we see this real uprising of Antifa, Black Bloc, anarchist movements, who are not real anarchists by the real definition of anarchy. It seems as though they've stuck to the old ways of just being reformists, and it seems that they would be perfectly happy with a ruling class so long as they're the ones making the rules. To me, that's what it seems like, the modern common idea of what an anarchist is. But we are actually within that like not a part of it, but we are taking back the term anarchy and trying to, in fact, like, be revolutionaries within a revolution, to say, hey, 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 like, no ruling class, great. but don't just be mad at the one that's existing now. Let's really learn from our mistakes and try to make it so there will not be another one in the future, you know?
Absolutely, and that's very well said. I think that I always use the term or phrase, I am an anarchist without adjectives, right?
Right.
Because we have all these anarcho capitalist or anarcho socialist or anarcho Marxist and all this stuff, right? And anarcho syndicalist, right? And it's like, no, no, no. I'm taking it back to the root ideology, of the thing. And I'm not conjoining it with something else, right? Like I'm not compromising on it, because I feel like those are all forms of compromising because of and maybe rightfully so at some level, at some time period in history, because of the certain state of suffering that those people are going through. And that's something that I will eventually talk on here soon. But I wanted to mention too, it's like, anarchist literature didn't really arise until the 1700s, right? So, and the first anarchist author, at least most people think of it as Proudhon, Pierre Proudhon, Pierre Joseph Proudhon. There's a guy before him in 1793, and his name was William Godwin. And he publishes the book Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. And he sets like the basis for anarchism at this point in 1793. And so a lot of people overlook Godwin, even though he's pretty talked about by the ancient, like Proudhon talks about him, Bakunin talks about him and stuff. But the literature died out during there was no literature, is my point. So there's a form of nescience going on as you go further and further into the past. And the reason why is because there's a lack of knowledge. Yes, there's a level of ignorance, but there's also a form of nescience going on, because not only is the knowledge kept away from people through certain types of hierarchical systems that make sure secret societies, things like this, right? That through the church, through the state, that makes sure that people there's a power differential between people who have that knowledge and people who don't. And so when you get to the Middle Ages, right, and you get to the Dark Ages, like what that means is like anti-intellectualism is the Dark Ages. It really means that there's no historical writings on it. There are some, but it's very sparse or sparse, right? It's very scarce. And what that means is that we don't really see that kind of thinking arising in the literature or in the history, because we don't have any evidence of that. Doesn't mean it's not taking place, because it's definitely taken place. It's just we don't have anything to go off of during that time period, because it's an anti-intellectual time period, So that's why like a lot of people only look at anarchism coming from, late 1700s forward, specifically with Pierre Joseph Proudhon in 1840. So there's like a big gap there, obviously, right? There's almost 40 years. There's over 40 years between Godwin and Proudhon, who are the two main first authors. And Proudhon published the book, What is Property, right? And he proposed a very controversial idea that property was theft or robbery in some translations of that. Now, the way that Proudhon was writing was very interesting, and it's very difficult to understand his context of what he's writing about, because the style of writing, the style of literature is much different than what we have today, right? So you have to really like come from that mindset from the past. You have to get yourself out of where you are now, and you got to put yourself in their position, in their mindset in the past, and kind of understand what they were talking about. Because we look at words and the definitions of like the words that we're reading from like people in the 1700s, 1800s, and we think of it from today, we're like, oh yeah, like, and we're so literal, right? We're so very literal, and we've lost kind of a contextual understanding of correlative thinking when it comes to literature. I mean, look at Shakespeare, right? Shakespearean writing is so hard to understand, It's just like literature can be very difficult in that time period because it's so sophisticated. I think literature is downgraded, obviously, nowadays. It's freaking trash compared to back then. You don't see any Shakespeare's coming out, right? You really don't. But yeah, Proudhon, promoted this idea in his book that property was robbery or theft. And there could be, and you mentioned this when we talked, there could be a difference of definition with that, but it's really hard to understand because we're relying upon translations, right? So we don't really know like which translation is the most accurate or not. But if you actually keep reading his book, he has 3 phases of property, or 3 examples of property. One is that it's theft, one is that it's impossible, and the other one that property is liberty at the end of the book. And the first thing is that he's talking out against the monopoly from the state on property. So, and a lot of people get it contorted because the way that he's explaining property can be very hard to grasp of like why he's talking about it this way. And he's like coming from it from a different angle than most people would come from it. But he's really trying to say that when there's a monopoly on property, there's 2 things happen. If it's a monopoly from a centralized authority, one is that it's theft of your own personal private property, because he wasn't against private property, even though a lot of people think that that's what he meant. A lot of communists and a lot of socialists and Marxists think that that's what he was talking about, is that no personal private property. And that property is impossible under a monarchy or under a state control or a centralized authority, right? Or under any kind of archy, right? So the idea that it's impossible is because it's like, for example, today you could look at a house, right? You buy a house, and then you have property taxes. Is it really your place if the state can come in if you don't pay those property taxes? Well, no. They're claiming that it's theirs. So it's a theft of you. You really can't own it, unless you get some kind of tax exemption by being some kind of school or a religious institution, right? So the idea that property was theft or robbery and the idea that it's impossible comes from the perspective of you're living in a system. And this was he was speaking out against capitalism at this point, right? So capitalism was on the rise and in the forefront. And he's like, this is the issue, right? So this is why a lot of communists and socialists and et cetera look at it this way. And they take it to their left-wing, ideology, obviously. But what he was really saying, and at the end, he speaks about this, he's saying that property is really liberty. It's your individual autonomy. It's your individual sovereignty, And he actually believed in property, and he argued with Karl Marx at one point about his inheritance because he got inheritance. And Marx was like, inheritance should go to everybody in the community. You don't rightfully own your inheritance because I'm a Marxist and I should have the claim to everything that you own, and from your family and what they've worked for and the product of labor that they put into it. And it should all be for the greater good, and you don't get to voluntarily choose where you put it on. So it's just another form of taxation pretty much. And him and Marx, they discussed many, many things. And this is where they split off, was where Marx is like, I'm using violence and using the state to enforce this idea of trying to bring some form of statelessness through Marxism, which is an illusion, because we know that's not the case. They're like, we're going to make statism so powerful and so big and control everything with a centralized authority and control all the product of labor and the distribution of all the goods and all that stuff. And that's when the state will become stateless. That's Marx's idea. It's dialectical materialism. You take it all the way to the maximum extreme in his mind, and then all of a sudden it will disintegrate and it will become just like this communism, right? So that's the idea of where he goes into communism. And Proudhon was like, no, that's not going to work because you're taking away my individual liberty to choose where I put my product of labor. And somebody gifts me something, that's my right to use it wherever I want. And it's my private property and you don't have a claim over it. So this is kind of where we see this like division of property, because it all comes down to like what you can own and what you can't own. And this is the biggest issue within like the anarchist community, is like, what is property? And like, how do we define property? Because property can be so ambiguous when you take it to a bigger level. Like, can you own the whole world? So like Proudhon, you mentioned this as well. Proudhon said that unless you create it, then you can't really own it. You can't really own the planet because you and this is where I would, disagree with Proudhon. I'm not an advocate for Proudhon in any way, shape, or form. He gets many things wrong, but he's like, oh yeah, if you take you can't own land, is what he's saying, and it kind of aligns with that kind of communist, Marxist ideology where it's like, oh no, you can't own anything you don't create yourself. So he had an idea about like private property, but he also had this other weird communist idea about like you can't get resources from the planet and claim them to be your own, you know. So that was one of his issues with the philosophy. So we can see that anarchists struggled, and we're going to see this more as I explain some more stuff. Anarchists struggle with this idea of product of labor and property from there on. You know, you have divisions and after divisions of anarchists who are just fighting over, you know, what they can own and what they can't own, you know, and that's one of the biggest issues that I see coming out of the last couple centuries with anarchism.
Well, with Proudhon, it seems it's he's all over the place in his book, What is Property? I haven't I'm gonna bite my tongue a little bit because I haven't finished the book yet, but I'm getting pretty close. And you're spot on with a lot of your interpretation there. From what it seems though, is that it seems like it's an initial challenge to the state about property and what the state claims as property of their own, and the whole you can't have you the claim of ownership over land is like is a challenge to the state saying you didn't create it. It's not a product of your labor. So how can you stake a claim of ownership over it? And if you can't do that, if you can't claim owner, if that challenge is correct, how can you make a claim of ownership over the product of other people's labor on said land? Because
Right.
it's not a product of your labor. So this is Proudhon comes about in like the mid 19th century, and he's in the middle of he's at the dawning of like the industrial revolution where the capitalist is really coming up and making themselves known as like this is the new wave of authority, and this is how it's going to get done from here on out, and the autonomous living situation that you had before is no longer viable for the state, so we're going to drag you off the farms, we're going to bring you into the factories, and you're going to work for us instead. Because before the industrial revolution we saw a lot of autonomous living, and then the tax man would come a knocking and be like, well, eminent domain, you owe the king some shekels, better cough them up or we're going to come back with our spears and swords and muskets. And
Right.
and it's like this is how we saw capitalism developing, was through the industrial revolution, and this was an answer to that. This Proudhon fella basically coming up and being like, hey, everyone's saying that we owe you this stuff. Well, how do you get to claim ownership over that? And like Proudhon even mentions himself that he considers to have himself to have three masters, the first of which is the Bible, the second of which is Adam Smith, and the third of which is Hegel.
Right.
So we get a little bit of an insight into the foundation of Proudhon's argument through understanding who he considered to be the people who educated him and where his argument comes from. So he's well versed with Adam Smith. His large parts of his argument come from a biblical sense where like like God is in charge here, not you, not the
Right.
state, and God's in charge. So I mean, it's again, I'm I'm getting through the book. I'm learning as I go, but he does in fact mention voluntarism.
Mhm.
He is the guy that comes up with the movement of mutualism,
Right. I was
and
about to mention that.
mutualism comes from Proudhon's argument about what is property. So it's almost like we have to, again, like what you said, and I love that you said it, we have to kind of in our minds take us back to when these writings were being jotted down and understand the context and the parlance of the time in which the articles and the books were written in order to really gain a firm understanding of what these people writing these books actually meant. And robbery could I want to know, like, back then, was there a difference between robbery and theft? I know it sounds like we're splitting hairs there, but that's how far language has come, though.
Right.
Like,
Right.
we don't speak the same English that was spoken back then, and this wasn't even written in English, it was written in French, and we're working off of a why can't I think of the word?
Translation.
translation. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're working off of a translation of something that
Trust
was
me, I
written.
do it all the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think what you said is very well said. It's very astute of you. I haven't read Proudhon's book since I was like in my mid-20s when I was doing a bunch of this research, and I briefly did a cursory, overview of it here to prep for this show. And I think what you said is very important, especially when it comes from like where did he get these ideas? So like George Hegel, right? So we obviously talk about the Hegelian dialectic a lot, right? Specifically in the idea of controlled opposition or like problem reaction solution, Um, so it's like you got the thesis, then the synthesis, and then the solution, the artificial synthetic solution
Well,
of those two things, right?
the Hegelian dialectic and is thesis,
Oh,
antithesis,
right. Yeah,
and
yeah. Sorry.
and then a synthesis of the two.
Right,
So,
and
like,
synthesis. Yeah, I said that incorrectly. Thank you for correcting that. Um, yeah, so that's the idea, but that can also be used positively in many ways. And Hegel was criticizing the dialects of like Socrates and Aristotle at one point as well, right? So that's what his criticism was, like this is not going to get us anywhere. So a lot of people, I want to say something about this. A lot of people will like say, oh, he's saying Marx was out for a centralized power of, distribution, redistribution, and everything of product of labor and products and goods and all that stuff, right? And it's like you have to look at like how it was done, right? It's done through the hands of the state. So it is a centralized authority, even though that ostensibly they're claiming that each individual owns a percentage of the product, like and that's what they're trying to get done through a communist ideology, right? That's what the end goal is supposed to be, a stateless society of communism, which is going to be some utopia, right? But really, when it's applied, what happens is that the state gains more power and more centralized authority over those resources and how we distribute those things. So, and Marx talks about this himself. Another thing about Marx is really interesting is that we actually find out that he was affiliated with a lot of dark occultists and a lot of different secret societies. And when you really dig into it, you understand that he didn't even write the Communist Manifesto the way that a lot of people think he did. He had a lot of influence and a lot of help in that from backseat dark occultists that most people don't know about, and I can't remember some of the names off the top of my head, and I should have put them in my notes, but that's something to consider when looking into Marx. The other thing I'd like to say before we move on in the timeline here is that Mikhail Bakunin was an anarchist who also was part of these great thinkers at this time, right? When it comes to like Marx and Proudhon, and Proudhon was in the 18th, in 1840. So Mikhail Bakunin came after Proudhon, and so did Marx. But Mikhail Bakunin was an anarchist thinker, and he was actually deemed the most dangerous man alive by the state at one point. Kind of like Emma Goldman, who was a female feminist anarchist in the mid 19th century, I think. Somewhere around there. I have it in my notes, but she was also deemed the most dangerous woman of her time, and like, so that just that label alone, there's some shit going on with this guy. And he actually was part of the International Working Men's Association, okay, which was like called the First International. And this is where you had a bunch of, and this is like in 1864, a little bit beyond Proudhon, right? So Mikhail Bakunin, Karl Marx, you had all these like different thinkers coming together in this international. Communists, socialists, and anarchists were part of this as well. And what they were doing at this time period was, see, the anarchists were trying to stick to their principles to a certain degree. And this is something that a lot of people fail to recognize from this. But you have to understand that they were looking for sympathy for their cause. And at that time, we didn't really have too many examples of like communism or socialism or Marxism in general that we could look to see their failures, right? So the anarchists were actually believing in these other, isms, and saying like, because Karl Marx is like, I want to destroy the state, blah, 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 blah. I'm standing against all authority. And they had different ways of trying to apply this. So the anarchists were looking for sympathy for their revolutionary movement. And this was the way that they were trying to get it, was by organizing. And they were trying to organize, especially in these like working men's association, which eventually, led into like syndicalism, which is like labor the unions, the labor unions, right? So like this is the early start of those labor unions, right? And the weird thing is that the anarchists were actually in the second international, right, that came about after the Paris Commune, which I'll talk about next. Mikhail Bakunin was actually, and all the anarchists were exiled from the international by the Marxists because they saw an opportunity because the numbers of the anarchists had actually dwindled after the Paris Commune. So it's just interesting to see this power struggle because a lot of people look at it and they're like, anarchism is communism or anarchism is socialism or Marxism. And you see where they were like working together at a time period at you know, specifically in the 1800s, mid 1800s and into the 1900s, right? And this is where we kind of get like Antifa, right? And this is where the black flag, obviously, you know about the black flag. This is where the black flag started to get the other colors, where it starts to get the red on it, right? Because you have the red movement with it, right? The communist movement. And then you have like the yellow coming in on it. And then you have like all these other ones, all these other colors. And I'm an anarchist just for the black flag. That's why I wore all black for this. Okay. Like I'm just black flag. Okay. I don't want any adjectives. That's it. It was a failure. We need to learn from it. And that's it. And if you look at the history of this, you can see this. And the communists knew the dangers of the anarchists. That's why they exiled them, you know, expelled them from the international. They knew they were dangerous. You know, so it's really, really interesting because they knew they were dangerous to their true agenda, which was really just creating another state authority. And a lot of people don't want to accept that, especially the people who follow Karl Marx. So I just wanted to kind of hammer on that point a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Another thing I want to make sure that we mention about Bakunin, he I believe had a big hand in creating and organizing the first of what is known as general strikes.
Yeah, yes.
That was a tactic that he came up with because, you know, again, anarchism as a movement does have its roots heavily like rooted in the labor movement, in the industrial revolution. When it comes down to individual rights, workers' rights, like that's why anarchism is so mixed up in like communism and socialism.
Right.
Like this is where the adjective anarchists come from. So I want to make sure that that's mentioned and really hammer that nail into people, into their mindset about anarchism, because it that is how we understand where we are today with it. You know, not to jump forward too much, but yeah, Bakunin, he had a very big hand in creating the general strike, which really upset a lot of fucking people.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was on my notes as well. I think that's really important because the anarchists are looking for any way to subvert the system. And this was one way that they thought they could subvert the capitalistic system at this time, was to gain control over, you know, the factories and all this stuff by striking, you know, because they realized that it was bottom up, you know, like they were looking at it from the bottom up, like, yeah, we should own all this stuff, you know, like this is how we're going to do this. We're going to get everybody to stop working in these facilities and in the mines and, you know, in the industry. And, you know, what are they going to do? You know, like they're going to have to listen to us then, right? And this became a big thing, obviously. So we have to understand, like, strikes today, like you're saying, are a form of anarchistic thought, and where it came from an anarchistic thought. And this is something I wanted to point out, was that almost all of the things that we see in our world that have created revolutionary change has been from like some form of anarchistic thought. There were anarchists at the forefront of all kinds of great changes, whether it's the classical feminist movement, right, to the labor unions or anything like this. And it doesn't mean they were successful, because I think a lot of them failed. But it's just them testing the boundaries and testing like, hey, where can we get ahead? You know, and we have people like Lysander Spooner, right? We have him who was a lawyer, right? He was a lawyer. He actually worked in the law system. Yet, guess what? He was, you know, one of the most prolific writers, especially against the Constitution. You know, he wrote the Constitution of No Authority. So it's like, man, and another thing to rehash something I was talking about earlier is one reason why I wanted to talk about this subject is because nobody reads these people. It's like, first of all, schools are indoctrination camps, but you're never taught about these people in history. They overlook all the anarchist people at the forefronts of all these places. You hear about Karl Marx, you hear about all these people, but you don't hear about Lysander Spooner or Mikhail Bakunin or, Proudhon or any of these fucking people, right? So it's like,
Right.
wow. So that tells you a lot too about, hey, they don't want you to know about these people,
Yep. There's another, and as a, not really a tangent or an aside, but it's just, I'm just thinking about it right now. They tried everything. They tried general strikes. You'd walk off the job,
Mhm.
shove it in the the factory, the owner of the factory's face. How do you like it? We're not even here to make you your money. You rely on us. That's the type of example that they would try to make. And on the flip side of that, so something that um that aligns with something that like James C. Scott calls anarchist calisthenics, where you have the idea is that one day you might have an order that you don't that you shouldn't follow. So until then, every day you're going to kind of break little laws and go against the grain and do all these little anarchist calisthenics types of things, and try to subvert the system that way. And that way you can mentally prepare yourself. It's about critical thinking. It's about thinking for yourself and to mentally prepare yourself for the day that may come where you have to say no to something that's going to cause harm to a lot of people. And he puts it in the context of maybe the people in the early 20th century in Germany should have been doing some anarchist calisthenics, because he came up with this idea while actually in Europe, and he would watch people at crosswalks after they um when well I'm sorry, I'm getting my history mixed up, but yeah, he would watch people at crosswalks and he'd wonder, there's no traffic, why are people still waiting to cross the street? And he would cross the street without waiting for the light to change, and people would start wagging their finger at him and everything like that. But in his mind, he was like, well, maybe you guys should practice a little critical thinking every now and then, because it's healthy to do. So he calls it anarchist calisthenics. Now back to what I was at before I went on that tangent. I promised not to, but I did anyways. Something else that the workers did was, at one point they started going and doing everything by the book to show how inefficient the methodology passed down to them from the heads of the factory, how inefficient those methods of working actually were. In a way to show them, we know what we're doing. We break the rules all the time. We do things all the time that aren't according to the method that you pass down to us. And that makes you a lot of money. Now you're fucking with us. You're making it difficult for us to live. So now we're going to do everything by the book, and everything's going to come to a screeching halt. Shows how much you know. That's kind of how the message that they were trying to get across by doing this would be. So I kind of wanted to draw attention to that methodology of protest as well, because it is a method of protest where every day us as workers, we do things that aren't necessarily by the book, and it cuts corners. And okay, without those cutting of the corners, how much profit are you really making there, massa? You know what I'm saying? So
Right.
I figured, what better time before we moved on? I wanted to make sure that got in as well.
Yeah, that's very well said. And yeah, there's so many different techniques that can be looked at. I call it anarchistic guerrilla warfare,
Yeah.
Like it really is. It's an ideological guerrilla warfare, and then it actually becomes a physical guerrilla warfare at a certain level. And we see a lot of that taking place. So the next stage in the history. So we're moving on from like 1860s, right? Now we're in the 1870s pretty much. So we have what is modernly and well known by a lot of anarchists, which is called the Paris Commune. Now, this is actually taught in school. This was a brief time in Paris during a very, very bloody time, actually. This was March 18th to March 28th, which was like a 73-day period. And the commune was a result of Paris failing to defeat the Prussian, like falling to the Prussian War, pretty much. Okay, the Franco-Prussian War. And the French National Guard at this time came in to defend Paris, and the working class and the radicalism within the working class at this time grew, and its soldiers, following the establishment of the Third Republic in September 1870, they had a defeat to the French army. Okay, so this was a big thing. So what happened is that pretty much they seized control of the city, right? They seized control of the city in 1871 on March 18th, and they started this commune. And it was sort of like, it's really hard to explain because there was so many mixing. It was like a mixing pot of so many different ideologies. A lot of them were communist, right? A lot of them were communists, and this is why it was a commune. But there was a lot of anarchists there at the forefront of this. A lot of them. Bakunin was part of this, actually. He came there and was part of this kind of revolutionary thing, and it was very short-lived. So, and it's weird because it was actually the National Guard that actually seized the city and created this commune. So they actually had like the National Guard on their side for this. And they were just so, after the Prussian War, it was like Paris was just so weak and there was all this stuff going on over there, So they seized the city and they actually created a stable for a time period for 73 days, or a little bit less than that. Somewhat of a stable kind of free market, weird conglomerate of like anarchist thought, Marxist thought, and all this weird shit that was going on, right? But it eventually declined within its own walls from domestic, issues. And one of the issues is that they actually the communists created a law. They passed a law at this time period very quickly, which was called the Law of Hostages. And they could literally arbitrarily arrest anybody who is anti-commune. Okay, so anybody who is against the commune, they could arrest and then execute. And they actually killed around 100 people at this time period. And most of them were some type of city official, priest, or, somebody in the army or something like this, right? So you had a lot of people that were in places of power, some kind of politician or some kind of, priest, like I said. And that's a big part. So a lot of people look at this two ways. One way is that this is an example of anarchism and why it will fail. Now I'm going to get to why it actually failed in a second. The other thing is that this is the origins of anarchism, right? And I've had arguments with Marxists about this, that this is why anarchism is actually communism. And this is, all this crazy bullshit about this, right? And it's true. There was anarchists involved in this, lots of them. And the anarchists were promoting a lot of things like making sure that the poor were fed, making sure that the children were getting educated freely. So this was all free stuff going on. So there was like a big distribution of all the resources going on. And it was stable for a moment. It literally was. And then they got into a power struggle. The anarchists wanting a more voluntary society, and the communists wanting to like centralize authority a lot more and actually let's say execute people and go out and take vengeance upon a lot of people, right? So from there, we have like the French army that comes back in and they prepare for this. And it's crazy because what had happened was because of the delinquency and the breakdown of the internal ideologies, they actually left the back gate open to the city. And so the French army was like, no way. There's no way they left the city open. So one of the generals sent out one of the soldiers to find out, and they did. And they freaking marched through that place, and they killed, some people speculate to this day, up to 20,000 people. So this is the state coming in and destroying a potential at this time of something that is anti-state, right? And it's not necessarily, I'm not saying that I'm advocating for that, but I'm just saying this is kind of like the borderline of being able to say that we had somewhat of a stateless, little commune going on temporarily where we actually overthrew the government, and the anarchists were involved with that. And this is what I mean by sympathetic anarchism, because the anarchists are looking for more numbers on their side. because at this time it's a very bloody war, right? Like there's war all over the place at this time, and they're trying to gain sympathy from anybody who's anti-authoritarian, and that doesn't matter if they're just anti-capitalist, right? They're like, yeah, join our cause, maybe we'll get through to you eventually with the principles of like, hey, there shouldn't be any forms of authority at all. So that was a big thing. Some people call it like a social democracy, like the Paris Commune, which is actually different than a democratic socialistic. So those are two different concepts. And a lot of people don't know about that, but it is a different concept. But really, it was really ran by the communists, and the anarchists were just there like helping out with a lot of that stuff. So what else do I got in my notes here about this? So the French National Army, the National French Army, started a civil war pretty much and came in, and it's called the Bloody Week, right? Because it was extremely bloody, obviously, and Paris went up in flames. Like it almost destroyed the city because the state and their authoritarian figures came in and just completely annihilated this, kind of free market socialism or free market capitalism thing that was going on there, right? And because there is a mixing pot, like I said. So they killed like over 20,000 people. They arrested 43,000 people, 13,000 of which were actually tried and I believe executed later on. And then the rest of them, were like exiled and, ostracized, and they had to move and all this stuff. So they took 43,000 people prisoner, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Lenin as well were all inspired by this act of the commune. So it was really interesting, like how these little things of like revolution, like these little spurts, kind of inspired what I consider to be the adversary of true freedom, like honestly. And if you actually look into Lenin a little bit more, in one of his speeches, he approaches the anarchist and he actually tries to sympathize with the anarchist, okay? Marxist Lenin, right? And he's like, we are no different than the anarchists. I'm paraphrasing that, but he says something to that effect. And he's like, we are not adversaries with the anarchists. So the anarchists at that time were like, wow, this sounds great. They're like, wow, we get somebody who's talking about this. So a bunch of anarchists started to follow Lenin for a moment. And then next thing you know, you got Lenin executing the anarchists, and then he's like, nope, and he comes out and he's like, fuck the anarchists, we're slaughtering everybody. So it was really wild, like how these things play out in history. And this is what I mean, like, people don't know how to follow the ideas through history. And that's what we're trying to do here, is just follow this idea of anti-authority through history, right? And it can be very difficult because, especially when you get to the Industrial Revolution, it becomes a huge mixing pot of like all these different, forms of states and anti-state ideologies. So very difficult. But yeah, the Paris Commune is a big event. It's extremely, extremely well known. Taught in school, like I said, and it's used and this was used as an example to bastardize anarchism.
It said that it was so bloody that the sewers clogged up, that like it was just a mess. Like it was so, yeah. And that the land was all messed up because of it, just because of the blood, So,
yep, that's right. Yeah, they had to stop doing what they were doing. The French army did, because the sewers were completely clogged with bodies. There was just so much blood. That's why they call it the Bloody Week.
Yeah.
It was, and you got to realize, like, this diminished the numbers of anarchists, because a lot of the anarchists, even the ones that were arising in the West, in United States, they came over to help with this, this revolution. So, they seized the opportunity. Obviously, after this, Marx seized the opportunity to take over, like I said, the International, Working Man's Association right after this, because the anarchist numbers had dwindled so much, and they knew that if they had enough numbers in the International, they were going to vote Marx out at that point. So it was, kind of interesting, like the battle that happened and arose from that. But yeah, it's really well it's important to know this, right? I think it's really important to know this because this is like a pivoting point for like the idea of taking real action against the authorities rather than it just being a literature thing. It's like, oh wow, we're actually like doing something now. We're getting activated. We're taking the power back, right?
Yeah. You mentioned Bakunin was at the commune. He escaped. You mentioned that he had to disguise himself. That's how well that's how well known he was. Like in order to get out of there alive, he knew he had to disguise himself to flee.
Right,
Just
right.
just to bring it back to that dude.
Yeah, yeah, man. That guy is wild though, man. Like
Wild.
I've always respected him, at some level, and he has great, great writing. So after this, we don't really see anything that really happens until 1886. And this is something that I really focused on, and I put a lot of notes into this one. So the Paris Commune and this event, which is takes place in Chicago at the Haymarket affair, or the Haymarket riots, or the Haymarket massacre is what it's called. And
Right.
this takes place May 4th. And sometimes, like they just have this big market, usually right around May Day, right? And this is kind of where like the whole idea of May Day comes from. And there's a bunch to this. There's a bunch of history behind this, right? So this is where the anarchists and the labor organizers, were pretty much coming together and protesting a lot of things, and also having like free market trade outside of the normal way that trading was taking place was at this market. And the anarchists were actually falsely accused at this time period of starting the riot that took place. So what had happened, and this is just from my research, it kind of goes back and forth with who actually started it, but the result is still the same no matter who started it. So as far as what the anarchists said in their literature and in their writing, the police chief actually threw the first bomb into the crowd, and it killed people, and at the actual officers is what it was. So they killed the officers, and it started this huge riot, and the officers just started killing people, just started massacring all kinds of people at this point. So what happens from this is that 8 anarchists are captured, right? 5 of which they actually convict to be executed. 3 of which were not even at the market affair, the
Right.
Haymarket affair. So there was 3 that weren't even there, but what the court said, like what the judge said in the jury room, he was like, it doesn't matter. We know these people weren't actually there, and they're just as guilty as everybody else, all the thousands of other anarchists or other people that were there. But it doesn't matter because they're the leaders, the head of the movement. So we have to make an image of them, so they like openly admitted that they were like, yeah, these people weren't even there, but they're the leaders of this movement. So we're going to make a public image about this and make it a public propaganda thing to actually show this. So they convicted 5 of them, one of which killed himself with a blasting cap in the cell. And then the other ones got hanged. The other 4, they were hanged. And this really sparked off like a huge movement against the state from the anarchists, a huge backlash, because it was like, hey, not only did this huge riot just start and like people were dying and all this stuff, and women and children, and it's like, well, now you just took our people who weren't even there and killed them. Now we're really pissed. Like we're not standing around for this, So, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, after the men were hanged, the governor actually came out and pardoned them.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And then the governor just out in the open said that he blamed the police for throwing the initial bomb.
Right.
It was a homemade bomb. No one knew who threw it, and then people were just massacred in the street about it. The police. In fact, tonight's show, the thumbnail for the show, the black and white sketch is a sketch of the Haymarket affair. If anyone's interested, that's what is in the background of tonight's thumbnail. And
That's what I thought it was. I'm so glad that you clarified that for me.
yeah, and so the Haymarket affair was like it was an organized strike for workers' rights. Again,
Yep.
here we see this theme popping up again, in industrial Chicago, which is one of the first cities in the United States to really get a get some real strong legs under it in terms of just the vast amount of industrialization that took place in that period of of American history. Chicago was like the heart of it. I mean, you had other cities popping up like New York, Philadelphia,
Right.
Boston. You had all types of cities, but Chicago, there was something special going on in Chicago when it came to the industrialization of the Union at that point. So what we see with the Haymarket Affair is like these people, workers' rights. That's again just the constant theme, and they were basically saying like "fuck you" to the capitalists. This Haymarket Affair eventually is something that leads to some of the first murmurings of the what would be later known as the Red Scare in the United
Mm.
States because
Right.
of the anarchist, like, people need to understand that the anarchist movement at this point is so heavily involved with communism and socialism that
Yep.
the two are intertwined. It's almost inescapable. It's hard for people to really separate the two. This is where we really see I guess you would call it the chimera
Mm.
being formed of anarchist and communist being so heavily associated with one another.
Yeah, that's very well said. Very well said.
And so, I mean, that like, but and that's where the communist threat in America comes from, is situations like this. So, I mean, with that, we can move on, but
Well,
yeah.
I'd like to add one more thing, and this is what became of this was International Workers' Day, right? So we had International Worker Day come out of this event, and then now, even to this day, in some places in the world, especially in Europe, this is a big time when anarchists gather to actually protest authorities all over the world. So especially like the years following this, there was many gatherings from this, and it actually led into some other events that took place. In 1891 and 1892, we have this thing called the propaganda by the deed, is what it's called. And
uh,
pretty much
Robo
what
Roboshod. What's his name?
Ravachol,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So what had happened was it was like a call to action, is what he did. But in 1891, police started shooting and killing women and children during the May Day protests, and this promotes Francisco Cohenstein, who is Ravachol, that's his nickname, Ravachol, to start to learn the technology or the chemistry of like nitroglycerin, right? So he starts to work with nitroglycerin, and he's an anarchist. Okay, so he's working with dynamite. So what he does is that he goes out, and this is in in Europe. This is in France. He goes out and he plants them in suitcases outside of like these apartment buildings of the judge and the advocate general at this time period. And he actually didn't kill anybody. He just planted them out there, and he's kind of doing like a V for Vendetta thing, like where he's symbolically destroying, federal property, like, and things like this, and trying to get a scare out of people. And so he does that. And the reason why he did it to the judge and the advocate general is because those were the people involved in actually convicting other anarchists between this time of certain types of crimes, quote unquote, that they had done. I don't have much information on that, but that was one of the things that he was targeting those individuals for. So no deaths came from this. It was a symbolic act, and he became known as the dark face of anarchism. And this led to the notion, like all this stuff, right, from like the Red Scare and like the Haymarket thing that took place a few years earlier, the riots, and then this guy starting to use TNT out in the public, right? This is where we start to see this idea that anarchism is actually terrorism, okay? And this is where the notion of this starts to take place, and the authorities are like, oh man, like we need to do something about this, right? So this is where we start to see, this is really interesting too. Anthropometric papers. So what this is like the first actual paper that was done by police officers who were scientists. It was descriptions of the body and descriptions like facial descriptions, pictures of who he is, how old he is, what he looks like. And this is how we start to get the police records of criminals. So it's actually because of an anarchist that we actually have this kind of crime investigative stuff like the CI, and all the CSI, right? And and so it's really wild because the first one was of this guy, Ravachol, that was ever created so that they could hunt him down and kill him, So this is the first time that we started to see the overlap with like the police force and like the scientists of like anthropology. So it was really, really interesting. A lot of people don't know that. So this became a huge headline all over the world about this guy, right? This terrorist bomber, and everybody's out for him. And they even wrote songs about the dude because he became a public hero, because even the public at this point were like, this guy isn't a terrorist. Like they literally were like, this dude is awesome, like he didn't kill anybody, but he literally is like V from Vendetta. Like people were like, wow, this dude's great, And so they wrote a song, La Ravachol which was a song, and it's, a French song. And it's like, I don't know it. I tried to translate it, but it's very interesting, the song. So you can look that up. And the thing is that he did get caught. And then the thing that he was talking about, and a lot of anarchists did at this point, was that they were trying to use the court systems as a megaphone. So he got caught. So he tried to use the court system as a megaphone for his ideology to justify his behavior and his acts towards these individuals openly in courts, and try to get to the public that way. Like, hey, look, the system is corrupt. They're going to kill me anyways, but you need to know, like, this is why I'm doing this. I'm standing up for your liberties, and maybe I do become a martyr. And this is kind of, an anarchist martyr in a way, because it leads to a lot of other stuff. So he did that. And then he had like the 3 cries for the revolution right at the end, right before the guillotine came down on him, and it was cut short. Ironically, he only got 2 of them out. But yeah, he had prepared the 3 cries for revolution at that point. And they cut him off before, because they were like, have any last words? And he went to say it, and then they fucking, cut the rope, let it go, with the guillotine. And guillotine is a horrible, horrible thing. So this actually acts as a catalyst for a lot of call to arms. So like anarchists all over the world start to take from this guy, right? And then we have this press in like 1892 to 1894, which was just an anarchist literature, like Anarchist magazine, right? And it became called, it transformed its name into the Dynamite Press, is what it was called. And this is kind of the forerunner to the Anarchist Cookbook, because they started to actually teach people how to use nitroglycerin in this press. So it was like propaganda press, but it was also like a teaching book, a cookbook, you could say, to anarchist weaponry that they could use against the state, And there's some more stuff that I can get into after this, but I want to hear if you had anything to say about that event, because that's a really wild event.
No, I don't. I just had I had some notes about propaganda by the deed being just, the definition of it is it's just the spontaneous expression of revolutionary action. And that,
yes, right.
And that it was, I always mispronounce his name, Ravachol, that like everything that you already said, was what I had in my notes. Really.
Right. Starting to cover it all. You're like, oh man,
no, take the wheel, man. You're
this
good.
damn anarchist over here.
You're good. Don't worry.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, it's a big thing, right? Because it does lead to like what we get in the modern day of like the Anarchist Cookbook. But yeah, Ravachol kind of is like the call to arms for anarchists around the world. And what happens is that you start to see anarchists going out after this in the later years.
Oh, that's
and
what it
start-
was. That's what it was. Is that was an inspiration to many other people taking up the same method of bombing,
Right,
and that he Ravishah didn't kill anyone, but
right,
the people that took up that same method, they did kill people.
right.
They would bomb. They'd bomb restaurants. They would bomb.
Yep.
They even got certain government buildings, and just randomly where they thought that the people in control were at. They would just toss a bomb in there and see what happened. So
Yep.
that was actually something. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. And yeah, I'm glad you defined propaganda by the deed, because that's very important to understand. But yeah, so a lot of people, like you said, just started to go out and bomb, try to kill public officials and stuff like this, and they killed a lot of innocent people. But it was seen as collateral damage in the face of everything that was going on, right? So they were justifying this. So I believe, yeah, and there was bombings all over the world, but mainly in France. So this is like a big thing in France. We already know, like France, in Paris and all that stuff, it's fucking bloody over there. Like these people get wild over there. It's fucking crazy. And the anarchists got really wild over there. So there was a president actually stabbed and killed. So it wasn't just bombs that got inspired. Like this guy, Geronimo Cassiro or something like that. He's an Italian anarchist. He actually stabbed President Saadi Carnot and killed. And so they convicted him. They found him. They executed this Italian anarchist, and then they threw him in an unmarked grave, which is kind of ironic because anarchists kind of stand against like the Christian notion of all that stuff in a way, like in some aspects, even though there's Christian anarchists. So it's ironic they threw him in an unmarked grave to kind of diss him and diss the people. But it's like he probably, maybe, possibly didn't really give a shit, and neither did the anarchists. It's like they just didn't want him to be a symbol. They didn't want to have like a symbolic thing like, oh, yeah, this is the anarchists who killed the president. Like we don't need a statue or a headstone for this guy to inspire more of this shit. Right. So that's what their intentions were. For this. So after that, they started to heavily increase the oppressive measures on the people. And they enacted a law called the Villainous Law at this point. And it was a ban on all anarchist and all like anti-military propaganda. So like no more anarchist magazines are allowed, anything like this, right? And it included anybody who was libertarian as well. So any kind of libertarian mindset was banned as well, because anarchism and libertarian were kind of seen as the same thing. And this is really weird too. Not weird, but just to show how far they're willing to go and how fucked up these people are. They actually went and arrested people, and even some people died for even just subscribing to those magazines. Okay, they weren't even involved with the bombings. They just subscribed to the magazine. So we can see part of this censorship going on, this cancel culture stuff going on with this. So yeah, and this is like when we first started to see the term "the war on terror" as well coming out in the public. So it was right around this time that we start to see the war on terror, the war on terrorism. So this leads to all of this stuff that we've seen, in the next century. About the war on terrorism, right? And we have to understand, like, most of the terrorists that I've ever looked into, and I'm not advocating for any kind of terrorism, obviously, but there's actually some legitimate reasons why some of these people are doing what they're doing. It's really wild. Like especially when you look into the Middle East stuff, it's like, wow. Like, and there's a lot of anarchists that are over there dealing with that stuff and how they're standing against authority. But you can see how it gets taken out of hand. And that's what we're trying to say here. Like, anarchism is so easy to get taken out of hand. And that's why all my work, and I'm sure your work as well, is to stop any kind of hot revolution, because we can see like these are examples of all the failures that we've had and how all it's done is escalate control from the state. That's all it's ever done. It brings the iron fist right down on everybody, and it's like, you can't have that. We have to be very strategic about this, and we have to approach this from an intellectual, intelligent aspect of philosophical, educative, edification of the population, for posterity and progeny. Obviously, it has to be a war of ideas. And I'm not saying don't have self-defense, because that's absolutely not in my rhetoric in any way, shape, or form. But I am saying, like, the first thing comes first, which is getting your ideas right. Because the issue is that when you have a mixing pot of these ideas, you lose and you compromise on principles too much. And we don't want that, because a revolution is just going to end up back in the same place. That's why it's called a revolution. You end up back where you started, and you really don't want that. I'm not saying it can't make change and it can't prolong things. I'm just saying, like, we want real long-term freedom. And anarchism is always there to challenge and to say, like, to every authority in the world and say, justify your position. If you can't justify it, then why should I follow it? If you can't morally justify your ideology and what you're doing, then why should I listen to you ever? Why the fuck would I ever listen to you? You're trying to coerce me into a system that I do not comply with when I'm not doing any harm. So, get the fuck out of my face and don't ever step foot on my property, So just a little tangent there. Sorry, I had to go on a tangent.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. Tangent, well received, and well, yeah. I mean, that is like fundamentally the purpose of what we do with these live streams and our podcasts, and trying to educate people on how, especially tonight. Tonight we're really focusing on the past and seeing, just like, every approach that we can possibly bring up tonight is, we're trying to see what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what we're doing today, if we're doing anything different. Because I mean, the definition is usually attributed to Einstein. I don't know if he actually said this, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. It's like, can we can go a different direction if we get a good look at history, and then we raise our consciousness of these topics to, and we raise them up to a higher state of vibration, bring that consciousness up, and realize that with our free will, we can choose to do things differently, and hopefully garner a better or different result than what has happened in the past, which has gotten us to where we are today. Because that's what it's all about. We want to build a better future, and even if it's small changes along the way, at least they're changes for the better, and not changes that further put us in the cage, further tighten the shackles. That's what we want to do. So I mean, we don't want a hot revolution. We want it to be a revolution of the mind. Because I can't change anyone listening to this. I can't change your mind. I can present you with good information. Hopefully it sparks an interest and you start thinking, the gears start turning. You change your mind for yourself, and you change the mind, the body will follow.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always say, revolution or evolution, right?
Right.
Like, we need to evolve into a higher state. And that's how we have to do this, is by understanding, our history. Are you getting some kind of feedback?
I am.
Yeah, I don't know what that's coming from. Oh, maybe it's my phone. I bet it's my phone. It's too close to the mic.
Get it out.
I bet it is. Is it doing it now? No, it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what it was. Maybe that's what it was earlier too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, from here on, like, we're starting to get to the late 1800s, obviously, and you start to see people like Emma Goldman, who's a famous anarchist author, and she moves to America, and you get like some weird stuff that happens, but it's not extremely important. You see a lot of female anarchists at this time starting to arise, especially people like Lucy Parsons, who actually was the wife of one of the people who were executed at the Haymarket affair. So like, she starts to speak out, and we get this like huge starting, of almost like a early phases of classical feminism, where they're like this is fucked up, like, and you start to see women coming to the forefront, especially as you get into like 1910, 1920, 1930s, So we have, I want to go to another event, and because I know we only have a little bit more time here. How much longer can we go on this? Another 30 minutes? Is that good?
Uh, however longer you want to, man.
Oh, okay. All right. I wasn't sure. Okay. So we have the assassination of President McKinley, right?
We should talk first about the conference, anti-anarchist conference.
Oh, yeah,
'Cause
yeah, yeah.
that
Yeah,
happened
bring it up.
before
I have it here. I was just kind of jumping over a couple things. So,
So
but go right ahead.
before McKinley is assassinated, we have the International Conference for the Social Defense Against Anarchists. This is
Right.
held in Rome, November, I think 1898. And this is the thing that eventually turns into Interpol.
Right.
So yeah, it was held November 24th and December 21st, 1898. And this was following the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria by Luigi Lucchini. Um, and she was assassinated September 10th, 1898. So just reading the article here, 54 delegates attended from 21 different countries. Every participating government agreed to set up special organizations for the surveillance of those suspected of anarchism, defined as, quote, any act that used violent means to destroy the organization of society, unquote. So what we see here is, and then, so that's what, that's what happens in 1898.
Kind of leading to the surveillance state,
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the
Yeah.
first acts, like, it's one of the first, one of the first times we see a globalist agenda, really.
Yep.
I mean, there's plenty, of course, throughout history, but this is one of the first major ones because it was this that leads to something that is still, I believe, Interpol is still a thing today.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that leads to it. So McKinley, they actually held another conference um, after William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, but this one was smaller. This one had only 10 governments sending representatives. So, and this was held in St. Petersburg in March of 1904. Then here is where we see the secret protocol for the International War on Anarchism being drawn up. Portugal and Spain were to subsequently agree to this, while France and Great Britain decided not to sign the St. Petersburg Protocol, as it was called, but did express a willingness to help other states on police matters relating to anarchism. But the odd thing is that McKinley was assassinated, which led to this conference, but the United States government didn't participate in the St. Petersburg meeting, nor agreed to follow its provisions. Theodore Roosevelt, who took over for McKinley, had called for an international treaties to combat anarchism, though. So, I mean, that's all I got off of this article here, which is interesting because it just kind of shows that, in one way, it almost looks like the United States was refusing to participate in any sort of globalist thing unless they were the ones calling for it, which
Right.
they
Right.
like that. So that's what I gather from that. But yeah, your thought.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting because that's like right around this time, we actually see a lot of the anarchists in their literature start to speak out against this type of action, this hot action, you could say, this call to arms and stuff. And they're like, this is not going to work. We see Spooner talk about it. We see especially some of the female anarchists talk about it. And there's one, I think, a Mexican anarchist, and I can't remember his name. And he really, really like hammered on it and was like, no, this is not the way. And there was another Italian anarchist who also spoke out against it, who actually started what was, I believe, like education for skills for like working people. So like these it's all over, it became very prominent all over Europe, where we had these like little, I can't remember what it was called. It's something in, in French, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's pretty much like these places that you could go to learn skills for work and stuff like this. And it's kind of like a decentralized form of education. And they started to pop up everywhere. There was hundreds of them all over the place, and he was a big influence in that. So, and he was like, "This is the only way. Like, education is the way, and going out and assassinating people is not the way." Which was really spawned after the assassination of President McKinley. So, you mentioned that it was in 1901, and this is really interesting because what happens here is that this event is used to actually bring up the idea of capital punishment. Okay. Like obviously it's already been in effect, but like the electric chair is brought into this by Edison. So Edison looks at this event of the anarchists and their bombings and all this stuff and the assassination of McKinley. And he uses, Leon is the guy's name who was the assassin.
Yeah.
And he uses him to bolster his DC current versus the AC current of Tesla, right? So he's in cahoots with the government. He's like, "Oh, this is perfect," So what happens right then is he talks to the government and he's like, "Hey, let's make an example of this and actually use this, and let's use my 36 millimeter camera to actually record this and broadcast this." So this is the first time we've ever seen this. So this is the first use of the electric chair, which was done on an anarchist. And it's the first live recording of it where the public gets to watch it, So this was Edison, like not only bolstering his technology, like, "Yeah, look at me, we can kill the terrorists, this is why DC is so good." But it's also like some of the first filming that we got coming out, So it's really interesting how that takes place.
Yeah, for sure. It's it's like a big product placement for Edison. Like this is how he views it. And then the government's like, "Oh, well, perfect. We can make an example as at the same time." And the footage of this is actually available. And you can watch it,
Yep.
and they're sitting there watching this guy get electrocuted to death, and I just, wanted to bring that. I'm glad that
Yeah.
you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's wild though, because obviously we speak out against Edison a lot, especially when it comes to Tesla, and Tesla was the inventor of AC, and we use a lot of pretty much everything we have is based off Tesla's, work. But so it was really interesting to see like how you have these crony capitalists is what I'd call them, like Edison, who are like, "Hell yeah, like this is a great example for me," and nobody ever teaches you this. Like, who taught you this, right? I mean, I was homeschooled, right? So I did learn a little bit about this, but like when I talk to people about the assassination of presidents, it's like the only one they can bring up is Kennedy. That's the only one they ever bring up. And it's like, did you ever get taught about the anarchist assassin? Like,
I mean, that and Lincoln.
and Lincoln. Yeah. And Lincoln. Absolutely. So you really don't ever hear about McKinley, right? Nobody ever really talks about McKinley and the anarchist assassination. And I just think it's a form of them trying to sweep it under the rug, like this really didn't happen. Like you were,
Yeah. Oddly
like,
enough, that's the name of the street that I live on.
right. That's wild. That's synchronistic.
Like I was just like, oh, every time I see the street sign, I'm like, "You got killed, motherfucker."
Right. So then, like after this, we have like in 1905, we have the Russian Revolution starting to take place, right? The establishment of the Worker Council or the Soviets, which became like a key component in anarchist organizing in Russia that led to what is called anarcho-syndicalism. And this is like the idea that they could tackle capitalism through like, these early phases of the labor unions and stuff like this. So that's pretty much what syndicalism is just this idea of unionizing the workers, right? So this created the labor unions all over the world, and it led to a lot of this. And so this has a lot to do with the Bolsheviks as we move forward in history and how the anarchists were, a part of this in many ways. And that's a really interesting study. That's a big one to get into. But another idea that came from this was like what is called self-sufficient trade unionism. And it was like, hey, we don't want any political interference within the unions, So that was another thing that was starting to take forefront. So as you pointed out, and as we keep pointing out, a lot of this comes down to like the workers, right? This all comes down to like the product of labor and what we're doing, and the ineptitude of like how the industry is running and how people are being killed in the mines and all this stuff, right? So we have we have more strikes that take place from this, like the revolutionary strikes that take place. And, there's all kinds of women at this point that are coming out and like they're marching against this because their husbands are dying at this point. And a lot of these women were anarchists, right? So they're like coming out and they're like, hell no, we're not taking this anymore. We're left at home with our families. Our husbands are dying because of the system, and a lot of them were advocating for stateless societies at this time period, which you don't learn in history class or anything like that. So then it kind of moves into 1917 when we have the Russian Revolution that leads to the establishment of the Bolshevik government, with Vladimir Lenin, obviously. So the anarchists are initially supportive of this. This is what I talked about earlier, right? But become increasingly critical of the authoritarian nature of the Bolshevik government. So, there's a lot to that, and I'm not going to open all that up because Russian history is very, in depth and very complex when you get into all that. But I just wanted to point out that the anarchists were sympathetic towards the Bolshevik Revolution, and that eventually they were like, "Oh man, we've been duped. We've been hoodwinked." And we're just taking a step back from that. So this is more of what you're talking about, where anarchism gets wrapped up in that Red Scare. And this is where we get the red stripe on the flag of anarchism, right? Even though that gets associated with anti-fascism. And that's another thing that arises here in the early 1900s as well, is the fascist regimes that take place. And then, anarchists are standing against that. And a lot of anarchists were like, yeah, it's great that you're standing against, like to the Antifa movement. It's great that you're against fascism, but what about all these other people? What about all these other communist, Marxists, like all these other authoritarian regimes? Like, it's great that you are against that, but you're like focusing on one aspect of a major problem that has a centralized root, which is the belief in authority and the idea of the state existing as a legitimate construct to govern society, So it's really interesting. That's why I've always like criticized punks who are like running around with the anti-fascist thing. And we see today, like what Antifa has been doing, they become fascist. So yeah. It's disgusting, right? But it gets wrapped up in that, right? So you see a lot of people who are Antifa who run with the A of anarchist running around. So it gets pretty interesting with that.
Yeah, it is the Bolshevik Revolution, with the Bolshevism being brought into Russia, like the anarchists in that time, in that place, they helped. And then as soon as the government was established, as soon as Bolshevism took the reins of control over there, they turned right around and said, "Oh, you're anti-authority. Well, now we're authority, so you're anti-us. Fuck you, you're dead." So
Right.
they tracked down many anarchists, fled from the region at that point into other places, but the Bolsheviks, they really hammered down on them hard. They hunted them.
Right, they did. And then we see like the Red Army come in and crush the Bolsheviks, right? So we have the Red Army that comes in 1921 that like, pretty much is like the turning point. And that's when really, this is what you're talking about, is like really when the anarchists started to critique all that stuff, so it gets really interesting when you see that stuff taking place. Another major event that a lot of people point to is in 1936 with the Spanish Revolution. So like we're just covering world history now, like we went all over the place, right? We're it's funny because there's not much stuff in Asia though that we see besides like China and Japan when it comes to this stuff. I always wondered about that, and there is some anarchist movements over there, but nothing like what we see that's taking place between like Russia and then obviously the West specifically. So yeah, 1936, we have the Spanish Revolution that takes place with a military coup against the democratically elected government, right? And then the anarchists and other at this time, because the leftists were kind of involved with the anarchist stuff, play like a prominent role in resisting to the coup and the establishment of the Workers' Council and Catalonia and the other regions at this point. So like that's another like period of where anarchists are part of these revolutions, and like, you know, we can see that we're still compromising on stuff, but we're trying to help, we're trying to be involved, we're trying to activate, we're trying to get people to be sympathetic towards our cause and to realize like, hey, you know, like this is not the way, you know, like this is leading to more bloodshed, this is leading to more, you know, authoritarianism all over the world. So yeah, I mean that, and that's pretty much what we see throughout the next few decades, like as we get into World War One and World War Two and all that stuff, right? So through this whole period of World War One and World War Two, you know, in like 1945, we have like the anarchists at the forefront, like saying, you know, this has to go, you know, like this has to fucking stop. So it's pretty interesting. I don't know if you got anything to add into any of that.
Nothing about the Spanish Civil War. But yeah, I mean, post World War II, I mean, this is where we start seeing more, when people think of anarchy today. This is like after World War II through like the 60s into the 70s is where we start seeing the modern culture really start to develop around like the punk scene, the free love movement in the 60s. Like this is the roots of the modern idea of an anarchist.
Right. Kind of took off over in Europe, and then, you know, us in the United States adapted it or adopted it with especially the music, right? So anarchism became a big influence in the music, and a lot of people were taking that up, especially coming out of like the counterculture of the hippie movement, you know, and coming into like proto punk, and anarchism was involved with punk and just anti-authoritarianism at this point. So the music was the way that we were getting through to people at that point. So music was the way of like spreading the propaganda. It went from magazines, even though we're still using zines and stuff like that, but music was the big thing. It was the big hook, especially with like now we have all these TVs everywhere, you know, we have record labels. Music is the way that we can spread this knowledge all over the place, right? And that's kind of what we do see. And then a lot of people do associate a lot of that movement to you know, like the counterculture itself as a psyops, because the military was so involved with like the hippies. You know, there's a lot of stuff to that.
Well, I mean, also the military, they're the ones that are in charge of the radio. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep. Yep.
so they're the ones that are owning the record labels. They're like, so it's all getting funneled through this fine mesh of I guess you could even attribute it to being controlled opposition. You could attribute it to something along those lines where these people are, I mean, for crying out loud, how many times, I mean, we get into like people like Mark Devlin's work, uh,
Right.
even our friend Sean McCann, he knows the history of the radio, and even like
McGowan, or is that
Dave,
his name?
Dave McGowan.
McGowan. Yeah.
He
Dave
has
McGowan. Yeah. I read his book.
a book called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon,
Yeah.
where we see these exposés of where does the counterculture movement come from, and we see
Yep.
these nepo babies, like that's a term for nepotism, these
Yep.
kids that are put in these positions. The most common one that everybody talks about is how Jim Morrison's dad was the admiral of the fleet of the Gulf of Tonkin incident
Yep.
that led us into getting into the war in Vietnam, which was a false flag operation or whatever the fuck. And like that's one of the most common ones, but we see this theme popping up where it's like the most famous musicians who are the ones that are like the rebels and the rock and roll stars are like military babies. Well,
Yep.
who owns the radio? Who owns the record labels? The military does. And of course, the dad does really well in the military, so the dad's kid is going to be a rock star. You know, their album is going to be the one, because it's like you can control them. You know, these people they can't really be trusted.
Yeah.
Like, like
Oh,
for
go ahead.
crying out loud, like the Sex Pistols, like isn't they're a fucking boy band.
Yeah.
Like they're a British boy band, for crying.
Yep.
They're not even a real band. Like it's like they were just like slapped together,
Yeah, picked up off
like,
the streets.
yeah, exactly. Like it's not like uh a real grassroots band, you know?
Yep, it's the
So
facsimile. You got that.
so I mean, and those are like the Sex Pistols, they are the ones that like anarchy in the UK, and like you see this like this slogan being shouted at the top of the lungs by Americans. It's like, dude, you live in Boston. Anarchy in the UK is nice, but what about anarchy in the USA, you stupid fuck? Like, stop saying that. Stop it.
Right, right.
And not to mention, like, you're repeating this thing that like they they're not real anarchists anyways.
Mm.
So I tangent over.
Well, I think one of the crucial points that I like to point out, and I've said this a lot, and this kind of attaches to what you're talking about, is that through World War One and World War Two, we have such an increase in the technology, the military tactics, and the implements of military warfare, with geopolitics and with all the spy stuff that's going on. There's so much stuff that with all the mind control techniques that they're studying, and all the advancements of the anatomy of the brain and how we can control people, and there's just so many implements of new technologies that are all used for oppression, right? And one of the things that I think is that they've already got the idea, not just the idea, but the ability to capture the anarchist movement and totally wrap it into their political agenda. Anything that was beyond the pale, you could say, anything that was barbarism, anything that's seen as, a rebellious nature against authority. They figured out how to co-opt that into their agenda through controlled opposition, like you're talking about. And now it's become like this trendy thing, and they can utilize that as a weapon against the people, because we don't really see anything else like we've seen prior to this time period take place ever again. We really don't. We don't see anything like this take place. I mean, there's very, very small examples, especially in the Middle East, but we really see the anarchist movement like die out again. It's kind of like this, and I'm talking about the true anarchists, even though most people would associate this to anarchism coming back, but it's really not that. It's completely the opposite, because it's
Right.
like, you don't really have anything. You're not doing anything. You're not really educating anybody. You end up becoming a bunch of cynics. You end up becoming a bunch of, hipsters in costumes, and you end up,
Well, that
just
and
having, like the people who just become absolute hedonists,
I was about to say that and the cynicism and the alcoholism, the drug addiction, all of these 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 crippling things to the movement that are associated with like punk rock and rock and roll, and the way that the culture has kind of grabbed the hand of the individual and led them down a path of self-destruction on an individual level. And that's why you don't see anything of any substance happening after mid 20th century, because
absolutely
it's culture coming in and sabotaging an individual's understanding of self-worth
right,
and
right,
and ability to actually make a difference and to be autonomous. So we see these layers being kind of laid on top of one another when it comes to how culture has infiltrated the individual's mindset through television, radio, movies, everything. And it's just that's how we see what has become of a personal sovereign. We could call it anarchism, or we could really just stop. We could just drop any sort of name and just call it personal sovereignty. We could call it voluntarism. All of these wonderful names that aren't anarchism, and you would still have the same. Um, you would still have you'd be defining the same thing, that's what we're trying to get at, is get back to what anarchism is really supposed to be about. And it's we're trying to wake people up, that we're in a condition of slavery, and that the culture is being built around us because these are the walls that keep us in, right? This is where the states. So the reason why, and this is from, some of the research that I've done lately, is the reason why anarchy and workers' movements and workers' rights are so intertwined with one another is because of how governments and states were formed way back in, like, even Mesopotamia in those days, Babylon days.
Babylon,
You know,
absolutely.
like these states were formed because of agriculture, and the people agreed to work together to keep each other safe, and in order for marauders to the people wanted the ability to chase off marauders and defend themselves from the rape and the pillage that would happen before these days, because as people shifted from a hunter gatherer tribe like society into a more agricultural society, then that's when you saw the walls coming up. Nowadays, the walls were there to keep people out, but they were also there to keep the people in. So the people that were inside the walls, you're a slave, you know. So I mean, this is why we see, anarchism so heavily involved in workers' rights, is because from the very beginning of organized states and governments and organized society, the question of who has the right to another person's the product of another person's labor has always been at the forefront of everyone's line of questioning, because it is heavily ingrained into the very fabric of our beings as humans, that we understand that our work, the sweat off of our brow, we produce with that, and that production is our property, and what happens with that property should be up to us. However, there are people that are providing some fake ass sense of security, who are attempting to subvert that claim and make a claim of ownership over that product for themselves, and they have no right to do that. And then we see throughout the course of history that it goes even further into making claims of ownership over even human beings. And nowadays, you know, it's just a state of duress that we're being held in. But I mean, this is the progression and the reason I really wanted to point out, like, the reason why that theme has been so heavily laid into our discussion this evening. And so I don't know.
No, that's really good. I'm glad that you brought that to the table. It's really important to understand, how these things kind of have grown out of this. And Douglas Martin had come in and said, anarchy implies no archons, as in no corporations or no proxies, as well as no masters and no slaves. So we can see, like, with that idea, right, that it can also apply to why it gets wrapped up as well with an anti-capitalistic idea, with it implying no corporations, so, and that's something that he educated me to a long time ago. So it's really interesting when we start to see this. And what I was trying to say earlier was, like, we have that nihilism that takes root in this. We've been psychologically traumatized from all the wars and everything that had come before, right? And that's epigenetically wired into us, and we start to see the psychopathologies manifest, especially during the 50s and 60s, at a major rate, especially with the kids, and we also see pharmaceutical warfare taking place at this time, like huge pharmaceutical warfare. It started earlier, but obviously that's a big part of that, so we have these psychopathologies that start to manifest, and the anarchist movement gets really wrapped up in that, especially with the punk movement, because we have a lot of people who end up being extremely self-destructive, masochistic and sadistic, and sadomasochistic, right, with a lot of this stuff. And they're like, oh, I want to smash the state, but all I'm really doing is hurting myself and stinking, and not caring about my own temple and my own body, and making fashion statements and stuff like this, even though a lot of people would argue with me about that. And I think there is some credible things to argue to a certain extent about why aesthetics can be a revolutionary, symbolic expression against authority. Rather than wearing the suit and tie, you wear whatever the fuck you want. I get that. I
Right.
understand that, but it's not a change. It's like my uncle always said something else. He always said, you're not going to sing your way out of slavery. You're not going to play your way out of slavery with guitar. You're not going to dress up your way out of slavery. It's not going to work. Like, it doesn't matter what costumes you do. So, somebody else said something here. Oh yeah, no problem. No problem, man. Absolutely. We're trying to do some good stuff here. So I don't know how much longer you want to continue or what else you want to talk about here. But I'm coming to my.
Well, we can call it. We can call it. Don't worry about it at all.
Yeah, I'm starting to.
If you're
You're exhausted.
if you're starting to fade, we can come back at an we can come back at another time to further discuss this or whatever you'd like. This has been wonderful. I always enjoy our conversations, Brandon. You know that.
Absolutely, man.
And
same here, vice versa.
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome. Yeah, we covered so much ground tonight. It's amazing that we got it in within 2 hours. I mean, there's so much more, even within the things that we talked about. There's so much more. There's always more. But that's the wonderful thing is that, like, at least now there's, you've sparked my interest to looking into more things, and it's great. And I hope that effect carries over to the audience as well. I really do want to press it into people's heads that, like, we've heard these kinds of slogans in the past about, like, learning from history. I mean, and this is important to do because I mentioned at the beginning that we're kind of revolutionaries within a revolution in itself, because we are seeing in the modern day a lot of these anarchist movements like Antifa and the Black Bloc anarchists that are that come about every few years, it seems, that they but we're seeing it get more and more press. We're seeing it get more and more attention. I do really, like, before we cut it off, I really do want to just, maybe you want to take a minute to talk about this, but I want to take a minute to talk about this as well, and just make sure that the listening audience knows that if you see, like, a Black Bloc Antifa anarchist out there with one of their pins that says, it has the anarchist A in the circle, and it says no gods, no masters. Anarchy does not mean no gods. That's not what it means. Okay, so these people are not giving you a proper definition of it. It doesn't mean no gods. It just means no rulers. And it's not like it's not like the measurement stick. It's just the ruling class. So I want to make sure that we get that in there. And that us being aware of morality and being moral objectivist, I just want to press it into people's heads too, that, like, we're not going to get out of this by violent means. Like, it's not the solution. Violence is never the solution. Self-defense is the solution. And the first and most effective way of self-defense, without the most peaceful way of self-defense, is called intellectual self-defense. And then using that intellectual self-defense mixed in with a little bit of effective, clear communication. So that way you can talk your way through disagreements with people, and to try to help people understand things, not from a sophist point of view, but from an actual, moral point of view, where you really want to help, and that you really want to make sure that people understand the concepts of what we're talking about, because we want peace. We want harmony with nature, and we're battling a big group of people, actually a small group of people who have control over a bigger group of people. We're battling against those people who don't want peace. They want the chaos. Order ab chaos is their method. I want peace and harmony with nature. I don't want to live against the grain anymore.
Same here, man. And I think that's really well said. I will give a shameless plug here that if you are interested in this, I will be publishing a new book here very soon called Rebels Against the State, Anarchist Philosophy. and its origins. So I'm almost done with it. I got 20 chapters and I'm editing it right now. It's all, coming together really well. I should be hopefully publishing it. I'm trying to get it out by September, at the latest. So
You didn't go with my title?
no, I know, right? You're like, no. Yeah, I know. The title is kind of a placeholder right now, so it might change. But yeah, I will be going through this, and it's going to be really, really in depth, and it's going to go through a lot of things that we didn't get to talk about here. It's also going to talk about the idea of what you were talking about, the atheistic movement in anarchism, and versus the creationist movement and the Christian anarchists, and a lot of that stuff, that we didn't even get to talk about here. And maybe we can talk about that in the future because that is a big thing,
I would, if anyone's interested in not waiting on that, I would point people in the direction of looking into something called animism.
Yes.
And that's a direction in which that will get you ahead of the curve, so to speak. It's something called animism. ANISI. I just fucked it up. Animism. I try to spell it and I can't. I'm so dumb sometimes. Anyways, that's
Well, one thing I was going to say is one final thing is that anarchism has commonalities with a lot of different philosophies all over the world. We see commonalities in the path of right living, the Eightfold Path of Buddhism.
Yeah.
We see commonalities in Christianity in some aspects, at least esoteric Christianity, with the Golden Rule. We see commonalities with anarchism throughout all kinds of stuff. So, it's not like this is some new thing or some, I don't know, some edgy thing just for you to go and do whatever the fuck you want without any consequences. That's not what we're really talking about. We're really trying to get to the fundamental objective moral principles and to, say, hey, like, we don't have to live this way anymore. Like there are better ways to live. And we can do that by living in harmony with nature and with natural law. And the only way we can get to that level is by understanding these things. And history is so crucially important when it comes to like trying to make a change in the world. Like people think it's just about understanding natural law, and that is like one of the main things. If we didn't have all the like scholarly indoctrination out in the world right now and all this crazy misinformation out there, then I would say that's all you need. Just understanding moral principles. But guess what? That's not the truth, because we're living in this crazy digital age with all this information out there, and we have to like push out the truth at such a rate that we can counteract all those lies that have been coming down to us through centuries, and that's a big thing, is like we have to be able to deal with the history, and we have to be able to deal with the scholarship and all that stuff. And a lot of people don't like hearing that, because it puts even more weight on your shoulders. Well, I'm not trying to make it harder for you, but I'm just saying, like, somebody's going to have to deal with it. We all don't have to deal with it, but somebody's going to have to take up that and really work with it. So
nicely said, Brandon. Well, let's get out of here. Let's call it a night, and we'll meet up again real soon.
All right, James, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Anytime, my man. I the first time we did this, I told you open door policy, dude. You're welcome back anytime. So I'm always happy to speak with you, my brother. So, yeah. So, anyways, next week, I think I have a special guest coming on. His name is Chris Nelson. He doesn't really, I don't know if a lot of people know about him, but he's really, really good. And I really enjoy his work, and I'm so happy to talk with him next week. That's what's planned. So we'll see. And then besides that, I really don't have much else other than if you are gaining value from this show, if you're gaining value from my broadcasts and whatnot, perhaps you want to consider making a donation. You can go do that over at freeyourmindne.com/donate. And there's a few different ways to donate over there. Pick the one that kind of jives with you, and anything that you donate is much greatly appreciated. So, it's it gets kind of expensive to do these broadcasts. You know, I have a website that I need to take care of, and next thing you know, like my microphone wire doesn't work or something like that. It's just tough. It can get tough. So anything that you can be contributed back is much appreciated. So without any further ado, or whatever, that's going to be it for tonight, folks. Thank you for coming and watching the show. Yeah, next week, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Come right back to freeyourmindne.com/live and catch the show. And we'll see you then. Thanks again, Brandon. I'll catch you later, buddy.
Catch you later. Much love, man. Much love.
Yeah. All right. And that'll do it for me this evening. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you everybody for hopping in the chat. And I'd like to just one more time thank Brandon Martin. So there. Have a good night, everybody.